Okay, look, before we start, we need to address something very important. If you grew up in Southern Africa or spent any time reading high school history textbooks, Muno Zimbabwe, you were taught a very specific, almost theatrical story. It goes like this: Mzilikazi, king of the Kumalo, former top general for Shaka Zulu, had a bit of a disagreement with Shaka about who got to keep some cows. Shaka said, "Give me the cows." Mzilikazi said, "I think I shall keep the cows." And then Mzilikazi looked at his army and said, "Guys, pack your bags. We are going on a very long, very stressed out road trip." He marched thousands of kilometers north, crossed the Limpopo, looked at the fertile, beautiful green rolling hills of the Zimbabwean plateau, saw the Shona people living peacefully, and said, "Nice land. I shall take all of it." And for decades, the narrative was that Mzilikazi conquered the entire Shona nation, took literally all their land, wiped out their empires, and made everyone his personal servant overnight. Except when you actually open the historical ledgers, read the archaeological surveys, and talk to actual historians, you realize the truth is way stranger, way more complicated, and honestly, a lot more ridiculous. Because if you ask the question, how much land did the Mzilikas actually take from the Shona? The real answer isn't all of it. The real answer is he took way less than you think, in a way that was completely weird. And the reason he got it in the first place is because someone else broke the house before he even showed up. Let's break down the actual history. Right, phase one, the land was already broken. The plot twist you were never taught. People think Mzilikazi arrived in modern day Zimbabwe, saw a mega unified, hyper powerful Shona empire, and single handedly smashed it to pieces. That is not what happened. Before Mzilikazi even crossed the Limpopo River around 1837, the dominant power in the region was the Roji Empire. The Roji were Shona royalty. Their warriors were literally called Varoji, which translates to the destroyers or the plunderers. They were so fierce that they had previously kicked the Portuguese Empire off the Zimbabwean plateau in the 1690s. These were not people you messed with. So, how did Mzilikazi conquer them? He didn't have to break the Roji Empire. Zwangendaba did. During the Mufetane or Difakane, the massive wave of migrations and wars sparked across southern Africa in the 1820s, another warlord named Zwangendaba led his Ngoni forces straight through the Roji heartland. Zwangendaba basically hit the Roji Empire like a natural disaster. He sacked their capital, scattered their ruling elite, smashed their central authority, and then kept marching north toward modern day Malawi and Tanzania. By the time Mzilikazi and his Ndebele people arrived in the late 1830s, the Great Shona state was already fractured into small, semi-independent chiefdoms. It was like arriving at a mansion expecting a fight with the owner, only to find out a previous part had already smashed the windows, stole the furniture, and left the front door wide open. Mzilikazi just walked in and picked up the keys. Phase two. So, how much land did he actually take? Now, we get to the core question. If you look at a modern map of Zimbabwe, you have Ndebele land in the west and southwest, and Mashona land in the center and east. Did Mzilikazi take all of Mashona land? Did he take the entire country? Not even close. When Mzilikazi established his kingdom, the Mtwakas or Ndebele kingdom, he settled in the southwest, centered around the Matobo hills and modern day Bulawayo. Historians categorize the land Mzilikazi controlled into three distinct rings. Think of it like a target. They call the bull's eye 50 to 80 kilometer radius. This was the absolute heart of the Ndebele state. It covered the area immediately surrounding Bulawayo and Matobo hills. Who lived here? The Ndebele core. Abezansi, Abehla, and Abehla. Abendla. Abezansi and Abendla. Along with local Shona groups, specifically the Kalanga and the Rose remnants, who were fully incorporated into the state. Was land stolen? Here, land was completely requisitioned for Ndebele military crows, cattle grazing, and homesteads. The local Kalanga and Shona populations in this immediate radius became Amahole, the lower tier of the social hierarchy. Though many were absorbed into Ndebele regiments, adopted the language, and became fully Ndebele over time. Right? Right. Two, the spheres of influence. This was the middle ring. Moving past the core into places like parts of modern Midlands, Gweru, Kwekwe, and border areas of Mashonaland. Mzilikazi did not occupy this land with Ndebele settlers. Instead, Shona chiefs in these areas remained on their ancestral land, ruled their own people, and spoke their own languages. The catch? They had to pay tribute. If a Shona chief agreed to pay annual tribute in the form of cattle, grain, iron tools, or tobacco, Mzilikazi left them completely alone. They kept their land, they kept their governance. The moment the tribute arrived at Bulawayo, Mzilikazi's message was, cool, enjoy your summer, see you next year when you pay again. 3. The raiding zones, the outer ring. This is where the mythology gets wild. In eastern and northern Mashonaland, places deep in Mashonaland East, Central, and Manikaland, Mzilikazi had zero land control. He didn't occupy it, he didn't farm it, he didn't set up governors. If a Shona chief in these outer regions refused to pay tribute, or if the Ndebele needed cattle, Mzilikazi sent his impis regiments on a raid. They would sweep through, take cattle, take grain, incorporate young men or women into the kingdom, and march back to Ndebele. A raid is violent, tragic, and destructive, but a raid is not land annexation. Raiding a village doesn't mean you own the soil, it means you took the cows and left. So, in terms of actual territorial occupation, Mzilikazi took roughly 20% to 30% of the landmass of modern-day Zimbabwe. The remaining 70% plus remained firmly under independent Shona chiefdoms who either paid tribute or spent their time dodging Ndebele raiders in hilltop fortresses. Phase 3. The secret weapon of the Shona, Granite fortresses. Why didn't Mzilikazi just march further east and take the rest of the land? He had the Zulu tactics, he had the short stabbing spears, Ikloa, he had disciplined military regiments, Amakanda, because the Shona had a defense system that Mzilikazi's army was fundamentally not designed to break. Granite. Eastern and central Zimbabwe are covered in massive granite gorges, hills, and complex cave systems. When the Shona chiefs saw an Ndebele impi coming across the plains, they didn't line up in open fields to fight a Zulu-style battle. That would have been suicidal. Instead, they took their people, their grain, their water supplies, and their livestock and climbed straight up into the granite fortresses and deep caves. The Ndebele military doctrine was built for open field, high speed, close combat, shock tactics. It was useless against a guy sitting 100 feet up on a granite cliff, rolling boulders down on your head, or tucked inside a dark cave with poisoned arrows. Mzilikazi quickly realized that trying to flush Shona chiefdoms out of the caves of Mashonaland cost too many warriors for very little gain. So he stopped trying to take the land. He settled for diplomatic arrangements. Just send the cattle once a year and we won't come bother you. Phase 4, muri Zimbabwe. Abantwana beZimbabwe. Phase 4. The great cultural plot twist. Who became who? Here is the part that blows people's minds. When Mzilikazi left Zululand in the 1820s, he had roughly 300 to 500 warriors. By the time he died in 1868 in Ndebele, he ruled a kingdom of over 200,000 people. Where did all those people come from? Math doesn't lie. Mzilikazi didn't have 200,000 kids in 40 years. The vast majority of the population of the Ndebele kingdom were Soto, Tswana, and you guessed it, Shona people, who were incorporated into the state along the trek. The Ndebele state operated on a three-tier social structure. 1. Abezansi, the original Nguni elite who came with Mzilikazi from the south. 2. Abentla, Soto and Tswana people absorbed during the march through South Africa. 3. Amahole, local Shona and Kalanga people absorbed in Zimbabwe. Over time, linguistic, cultural, and marital blending meant that thousands of people who were ethnically Shona became culturally, linguistically, and politically Ndebele. They spoke Ndebele, fought in Ndebele regiments, and defended the kingdom. So, did Mzilikazi take land from the Shona, or did a massive segment of the Shona population simply become part of the new Ndebele state? The historical reality is a mix of both. Phase 5. Who created the myth of total conquest? If Mzilikazi only occupied a fraction of the land, why does everyone believe he took all of it? Enda Cecil John Rhodes and the British South Africa Company, BSAC. This is the biggest historical plot twist of all. The story that Mzilikazi and later on his son, King Lobengula, owned literally all of Zimbabwe was not created by the Ndebele. It was invented by the British colonizers. When Cecil John Rhodes arrived in the late 1880s, wanting to conquer Zimbabwe for its gold and land, he needed a legal loophole. Under European international law at the time, if you wanted to claim a giant territory, you had to sign a treaty with the supreme ruler of that territory. If the British acknowledged the truth that Zimbabwe was made up of dozens of independent Shona chiefs and one Ndebele kingdom, Rhodes would have had to travel around negotiating hundreds of individual treaties with every single Shona chief from Mutare to Masvingo. That sounded like way too much paperwork. So, what did Rhodes do? He deliberately exaggerated the size and the control of the Ndebele kingdom. The British declared King Lobengula, Mzilikazi's son, is the absolute monarch of all of Mashonaland and Ndebele. He owns everything. Then Rhodes tricked Lobengula into signing the Rand concession in 1888. The British said, since Lobengula owns all of the land and Lobengula signed this paper, we now own all of Mashonaland and Ndebele. When the pioneer column marched into Mashonaland in 1890, Shona chiefs were looking at them like, wait, who gave you permission to be here? The British replied, Lobengula did. And the Shona chiefs said, Lobengula doesn't own this hill, he doesn't even live here. The British propaganda machine literally created the myth that Mzilikazi and Lobengula owned 100% of Shona land just so the British South Africa Company could steal 100% of it from both of them. Zimbabwe. The final breakdown, the numbers, to put it in clean, realistic numbers, right? Direct land occupation, 20% to 30% of modern Zimbabwe, primarily Ndebele South, North, and parts of Midlands. Tribute or vassal zone, 30% to 40% Shona chiefs kept their land, paid annual tribute. Independent Shona land, 30% to 40% never occupied, never paid tribute, regularly resisted raiding. The British colonial narrative, Mzilikazi took 100% of it, so now we own 100% of it. Pure propaganda. The bottom line, Mzilikazi was undoubtedly a military genius and a brilliant statesman, moving thousands of refugees across 1,500 kilometers, dodging Boer commando units, surviving Zulu invasions, and successfully building a lasting centralized kingdom in a brand new territory is one of the most incredible feats in African history. But he was not a comic book villain who erased an entire civilization and stole a whole country overnight. He took a specific region, integrated the locals, established a tributary border system, and left the rest of the plateau untouched until colonial powers showed up, rewrote the history books, and blamed the whole thing on him. So, the next time someone tells you Mzilikazi took all of the Shona land, you can tell them, actually, blame Cecil Rhodes for the script. Peace.